Space Haven has finally reached version 1.0, and if you've played it for a bit, you might have realized that the game has much more depth than it seems at first glance. Even I, after several attempts, kept discovering things that make a significant difference in how to play. And it was precisely by testing, making many mistakes, and adjusting my playstyle that I gathered 10 advanced tips that can help make your ship more efficient, your crew more stable, and your journey a little less chaotic. It is not a miracle cure, but these are things that really make a difference in the long run. This micro-storage logistics tip is exactly the type of thing that separates an okay ship from a truly efficient colony in Space Haven. When you start spreading small storages near critical areas, it is as if you are designing the blood flow of your ship. Energy, biomass, and resources stop getting stuck in a large central depot and start circulating where they really matter. From the outside, it looks like a silly detail, but in practice, this means fewer crew members crossing the entire ship just to pick up an energy rod, and more effective time producing, researching, or keeping everything running. The trick is to treat these microdeposits as actual buffers, not as any generic warehouse. You place a small storage right next to the kitchen, another next to the generator, another attached to the industrial area, and then you adjust the rules of that storage to always keep a minimum of energy rods, biomass, or the key resource for that machine. And then comes the priority trick. Set these deposits to high priority. This forces the haulers to stock these points before supplies run out, so when the cook or the machine operator gets there, they do not waste time going to fetch things from afar. Everything is right there. In the late game, this becomes almost mandatory if you do not want your crew living in a state of eternal exhaustion. The larger the ship, the more brutal the walking time becomes. Each useless round trip is morale lost, tasks that accumulate, and a general feeling that everything is slow and stuck, even with resources to spare. When you start shortening these paths with well-positioned micro-storage, the ship seems to unlock. Machines rarely stop due to lack of material, the production flow becomes smoother, and the crew's daily schedule starts to fit better into the available time. Another cool thing is that this practice of small storages with specific rules forces you to think about the ship's layout in a more professional way, almost like someone designing a factory. You start looking at your base in terms of routes, where energy comes from, where it goes, where biomass enters the chain, where it becomes food, where food is consumed. Advanced players treat these microdeposits as an extension of the machine itself. If there is a generator, there is an energy buffer. If there is a kitchen, there is a food and biomass buffer. If there is industry, there is a material buffer. It is one of those habits that once you pick up, it feels strange to play without. If there is one thing that completely changes the game, it is how you deal with invasions. And this idea of the defense funnel at the airlock is simply absurdly efficient. I like to think of this as turning the most vulnerable point of the ship into the deadliest place for any enemy. Instead of leaving the entrance open and hoping your crew reacts in time, you prepare the terrain to receive any invader in the worst possible way. The secret here is simple but powerful. Never let the airlock exit lead directly into a large space. When you create a narrow corridor right after the airlock, you force any alien or pirate to pass through a bottleneck. And that is exactly where you control the combat. It is no longer a chaotic brawl inside the ship, it is a planned ambush. Now comes the part that really makes a difference: cover. Positioning partial walls or even heavy machinery along this corridor gives your crew total advantage. While your characters remain protected, enemies emerge from the airlock already under pressure, often entering a state of panic. This panic detail is too important because it completely breaks the rhythm of their attack. In practice, what happens is that invasions cease to be a problem and become almost a predictable resource. You know exactly where the combat will happen and you prepare everything around it. To me, this is one of those strategies that seems simple, but once you use it, you never play without it again. This one is one of those tips that seems small but completely changes the outcome of a combat in Space Haven. I have lost a ship simply because, in a moment of desperation, the game assigned any random crew member to operate a shield or weapon. And then it does not matter how good your ship is, if the person in control does not know what they're doing, you will suffer. The main point is to stop treating your crew as if everyone is the same. They are not. When you enter the Priorities tab and completely block with X those with a low level in shields and weapons, you basically eliminate bad automatic decisions by the game. Only the right characters will take these positions, and this makes an absurd difference in the consistency of the battles. I like to think of this as building a real combat team. Your level 3 crew members in these skills become specialists. They are the ones who hold the line when things get ugly. Meanwhile, the rest of the crew continues doing what they know best, instead of abandoning important tasks or worse, taking over a critical console without any preparation. In practice, this organization avoids that classic emergency chaos where everything goes wrong at the same time. You no longer need to pray for the AI to choose the right person because you have already decided that beforehand. To me, this is one of the biggest signs that you have moved past the basic level and started playing Space Haven in a truly strategic way. This tip is one of those you only value after your ship becomes a walking oven. In Space Haven 1.0, the temperature system is much more sensitive, so you can no longer mix industry with habitable areas and pretend everything is fine. If you do not isolate heavy machinery, heat and gases start to spread, and before you know it, your crew is already uncomfortable, unproductive, and even getting sick. What I started doing is treating the industrial area as if it were another biome inside the ship. Double walls and well-positioned doors create a real barrier against heat. This completely changes thermal control because instead of trying to cool the entire ship, you concentrate the problem in one place. It becomes much more efficient. And that is where dedicated thermal regulators come in, which are practically mandatory in this setup. Placing them only inside the industrial room ensures that heat is treated at the source, without wasting energy trying to compensate for the rest of the ship. It is the type of adjustment that seems too technical, but in the long run, it saves resources and prevents headaches. In practice, this makes your ship much more stable. Dormitories remain comfortable, common areas do not turn into saunas, and your production continues without hidden penalties. To me, this type of thermal organization is what transforms an improvised base into a truly well-designed colony. It took me a while to realize this, but much of the inefficiency in Space Haven does not come from a lack of resources, but from how the ship is organized. When you start observing the path crew members take all the time, it is clear that the layout directly influences productivity. It is not just aesthetics. It is flow. A much smarter way to build the ship is to separate what needs constant interaction from what practically works on its own. Hyperdrives, solar panels, and turrets require almost no attention after installation, so it makes much more sense to push all of this to more distant areas. I usually leave this part at the back of the ship, almost as a dead zone in terms of circulation. The middle of the ship, however, must be treated as a living area where everything happens all the time. Kitchen, storage, and industry need to be as close as possible to the airlock because that is where practically everything you collect enters. When this distance is short, the efficiency gain is immediate, and your crew stops wasting time just walking from one side to the other. Once you organize it like this, the ship starts to function much more naturally. There is no longer that chaos of people crossing paths all the time, and each sector starts to make sense within the whole. It is a silent change, but one that impacts everything, especially when your colony begins to grow for real. There is a very common trap that I have fallen into myself, thinking that more research consoles will accelerate progress. In practice, this almost never happens. What happens is the opposite. You occupy space, increase energy consumption, and you don't even have enough people to use everything at the same time. After testing quite a bit, 2 consoles end up being the sweet spot for most of the game. With well-adjusted shifts, you keep research running constantly without overloading the ship. It is much more about consistency than quantity. Having 3 or 4 stations seems advanced, but usually just creates waste. Another thing that makes a huge difference is the order of research. When you prioritize botany at the very beginning, you ensure a more stable food base. Next, going for power capacity and solar helps secure your energy infrastructure without struggling. Then it makes sense to advance to X1 generator, energy refinery, and chemical refinery, because your ship already has the structure to support this growth. In the end, this makes your progress much smoother. Instead of chasing energy all the time or being stuck due to a lack of resources, you build a solid base step by step. It is the type of adjustment that does not draw attention at first, but completely changes the rhythm of your colony. I started treating the industry almost as a hostile area of the ship, and this completely changed my way of building. Instead of integrating everything with oxygen and comfort, the idea here is exactly the opposite. Take air out of the equation. Creating a room completely without oxygen for heavy machinery seems strange at first, but it makes much more sense when you see the practical effects. When you do this, several problems disappear at once. Heat is contained, fires practically cease to be a chain reaction threat, and you even reduce the consumption of resources like oxygen and water. It is like turning the most dangerous part of the ship into a controlled environment where risks do not leak into the rest of the colony. Of course, this changes the way your crew interacts with this space. No one will work there without a suit, so choosing well who enters this area makes a difference. Crew members with traits like Spacefarer or Hard Worker handle this type of condition much better and end up maintaining productivity even in this more extreme environment. This approach makes your ship much safer and more efficient at the same time. The industry ceases to be a constant problem and becomes an isolated, predictable sector. It is a change of mindset, really. Instead of adapting the environment to the crew, you adapt the crew to handle an environment that favors the ship's operation. There is a moment when you realize that just placing a heater or cooler does not solve anything anymore. The ship begins to suffer from extreme variations, and energy consumption skyrockets without you understanding exactly why. That was when I started using the so-called second hull. And honestly, this changes the game in a much more structural way. Instead of reacting to temperature, you start controlling how it enters the ship. Creating a second layer of hull functions as a real thermal insulation, almost as if you were dressing the ship with extra protection. The impact of this is immediate, especially when you enter more extreme sectors, where everything used to go wrong very quickly. The detail that makes this strategy really work is the use of connection blocks. It is not about putting them anywhere. The ideal is to distribute them at regular intervals along the structure, creating efficient connection points without compromising the insulation. And a mistake worth avoiding. Do not put these blocks at the extremities, as this reduces the system's efficiency as a whole. Once you implement this, the feeling is that the ship becomes much more stable. Energy expenditure drops, thermal control ceases to be a constant problem, and you gain the freedom to explore without fear of suffering from the environment. It is a more invisible solution, but one that solves one of the most annoying systems in the game in an elegant way. When you completely isolate the environment and control what enters and leaves, especially CO2 and temperature, crop yields rise quite consistently. A trick that seems strange at first, but works very well, is to take advantage of the crew itself as a source of CO2. Placing beds inside or near the botany room causes them to feed the environment naturally during sleep. When you combine this with CO2 emitters and well-adjusted thermal control, you create a stable cycle that practically maintains itself. Another detail that many people ignore is lighting. Instead of focusing only on grow lights, using wall lights helps with character comfort and improves the overall efficiency of the work inside. It seems small, but in day-to-day operations, this reduces lost time and makes everything more fluid. And there is one precaution that I learned the hard way. Never mix the kitchen with botany. Fires in Space Haven can spiral out of control quickly, and losing an entire room of crops because of this is devastating. Separating these sectors ensures that your food production remains safe, even when something goes wrong in another part of the ship. If there is one lesson I learned the hard way, it is that boarding combat is simply the game mode you want to master. Fighting ship versus ship wastes energy, ammunition, and risks destroying everything you were trying to loot. What might not seem so obvious at first is that instead of turning the sector into a space shootout, you are using the enemy ship's own space as a control plan. Boarding here is almost a logistics tool, not just a combat one. The second layer of this thinking is preparation time. When you enter a crouch as soon as combat starts, you completely change the rhythm of the fight. It decreases the spread of shots, reduces damage received, and forces enemies to expose themselves to attack. The scenery, in this type of closed map, is as important as the weapon in your hand. Containers, walls, and corridors become micro-shooting positions, and if you insist on standing in the middle of a corridor, you are basically playing against your own team. The crouch is not just aesthetic, it is a mechanical advantage that the game gives you for free. The smartest part of all this is the use of doors as a control mechanism. Learning to open and close doors at the right timing allows you to break up groups, separate the enemy, and create shoot-and-peek situations that favor your team. Instead of trying to nullify the enemy in a straight line of sight, you transform combat into a flow of space control. What seems like a simple mechanic becomes a positional advantage system. You tire the enemy out, kill them one by one, and prevent the loot from being lost in explosions. Finally, the control of internal conditions. Suits and medication. Taking off combat suits as soon as the environment is safe, as automatic as it may seem, is a huge performance adjustment. It improves accuracy, reduces shooting errors, and increases the feeling of safety in repeated missions. And carrying medicine is not just a healing item. It is a way to amortize failures, allow for more aggressive pushes, and ensure that a bidirectional boarding mission does not turn into a crew funeral. Boarding in Space Haven works like a game within a game. The more you see these layers of space, time, and resource control, the more predictable the combat becomes, and the more profitable.